everyone, may I present to you the Group 1, composed of Mr. Legaspi, Miss Lumondag, Mr. de la Peña, Miss Sardido, Miss Tenegra, Miss Panes, and Miss Elbanbuena. And we are going to report Lesson 1, Defining Learning Experience, and Lesson 2, The Learner. First on the screen is Mr. Legaspi.
Good morning, ma'am. I am Lance, and I am going to tackle about the defining the learning experience. So the first one is ability. This is an enduring trait that for most part are genetically determined and underlie a person's skills in a variety of tasks. People differ with respect to their patterns of strong and weak abilities, resulting in differences in their level of skills. Number two is, or the second one is the motor learning. So these are the changes associated with practice or experience, an internal process that determines a person's capability for producing a skill. For example, learning to dance initially takes time and requires a lot of practices before the task is automatically executed. Learning experiences. These are situations in which people make deliberate attempts to improve the performance of a particular movement or action. Goal settings. This is the process of establishing targets for performance. Outcome goals. These targets for performance that focuses on the end of the result of each activity. Performance goals, targets to perform that focus on improving some aspects of performance. Process goals, targets for performance that focus on the quality of movement production. Target skills, the skills of persons wishes to able to perform. Target behaviors. These are the actions people must be able to produce to perform target skills successfully in the target context.
Transfer of learning. The transfer of learning is the gain or the lose of person's proficiency on task as a result of previous practice or experience on another task. It is one of the concepts of the practitioners to consider when preparing to offer instructional assistance. Generalization. Generalization is a type of transfer of learning that occurs from one task or situation to another very similar task or situation. It is also referred as the near transfer. It deals with the transfer of skilled performance from the instruction setting to a particular target context, such as athletic context, piano recital, construction site, and for the therapy patient at home. This means that the performer adapts the target skills to meet the demands of another situation. For example, when the basketball player puts more arc on the jump shot she has learned in order to clear the outstretched arms of the taller defender. It also means the performer produces essentially the same movement she has been practicing all along, but does so under different environment conditions. For example, when the therapy patient with a prosthesis picks up objects at home after learning how to pick up similar objects in the clinical setting.
For transfer, a type of transfer of learning that occurs from one task or situation to another every different task or situation. It is the other way what a practitioner can apply the transfer notion when helping the learners to develop more capabilities for producing a wide variety of actions in the future. The learner. It is the center of learning experiences of a learner. In order for a movement practitioner to create the most effective learning experiences, they need to be aware of some important characteristic of a learner. And this characteristic includes personal motivation, abilities, past experiences, and the present stage of learning. The first characteristic of a learner is achievement motivation. Achievement motivation is the central context of motor learning. Additionally, it is the direction of intensity of a person's effort to reach a performance goal. either for personal mastery or for demonstrating superior competence compared with other performers. People can judge one's success in two ways, and these are with respect to improvements of the task itself and with respect to improvements in the performance as it compares with the performance with others. The effective way a practitioners can enhance the learner's motivation is to involve them into a goal setting. Once a successful practitioner remembers that people are motivated by their goals are personally relevant and process oriented. People feel successful about their own goal achievement when they have the best chance to remain motivated to learn.
Past experiences. Another way to look at transfer of learning is to consider the influence of people's previous movement experiences on their learning of a new target skill. If those experiences include the learning of tasks containing motor, perceptual, or conceptual elements similar to ones constituting a target skill, the practitioner can emphasize those similarities when providing instructional assistance. The essence of this notion is that task sharing a greater number of similar elements will transfer from one to the another. A greater extent, the tasks will little in common. When many similarities elements are present, performer can capitalize on their previous task experiences when learning a new skill. Recent research suggests that given sufficient practice, significant transfer of cognitive perceptual skills, and psychological adaptation can occur across certain ball sports. Elements that might be identical or at least very similar between tasks are movement elements, perceptual elements, and conceptual or strategic elements. Movement elements aspect of tasks that deal with fundamental patterns or action associated with correct performance. Therefore, practitioners could remind learners who have had previous experience throwing baseball that the casting action is similar to throwing a baseball. People who have not had a prior experience throwing might be encouraged to practice throwing to get a better feel for a movement pattern used in casting. The notion of fundamental underlying movement pattern was important part of our discussion of a generalized motor program. Perceptual elements are task-related stimuli that the people must be able to interpret to achieve successful performance. Practitioners can promote transfer of learning either by calling learners' attention to previous experiences that they have had with this task or by allowing learners to practice tasks containing similar perceptual elements. Some motor tasks contain similar conceptual elements such as strategies, rules, principles, or informal guidelines. Maintaining a narrow focus on the target is important principle to remember when performing activities. Learners who have had previous experience with tasks that have conceptual elements similar to those of the target skills can be reminded of those similarities to facilitate transfer.
Franklin M. Henrys to specify of learning that the skills are obtained in various practices and experiences, like overarm throwing and etc. Once the learner developed that the skill making his and her habits, the learner would pursue another various types of serve to improve. As the learner improves, their skill levels exceed their past skills. Learning experience of a person is to improve and perform their target in mind. The transfer training is a practice that the target skills is influenced by the environmental condition by the target context. However, there are negative factors to the learning principle of the learner. For example, the learner is trying to learn how to play tennis since the learner knows how to play badminton. But transferring one skill to another could degrade the performance of the person since badminton and tennis are different. Since different mechanics from different sports could vulnerable to a negative transfer. Negative transfer is a virtual non-existence in motor skills. The negative transfer are in the early stage of the learning, means that being liable to negative influence of prior learning. In short, the learner is practically clueless and just learning the boxes surrounding the skill, with the practitioner's help by pointing out the potential problems so they can find out and learn a new skills. Abilities. People with different level of abilities are inclined to have a successful performance and learning a certain task. For example, a person with naturally born with a high level of static balance can be as successful at more activities such as balance beam skills or handstand in gymnastics. But learner has an advantage if they had high level of abilities important to a successful task. For who doesn't has the ability, also impaired abilities because of an accident might make less accurate, making the performance obnoxious. But with practice, person who doesn't have the ability can make it up and to ensure the goal achievement. Most commonly misconception that fundamental abilities are improved by practicing various skills, but coaches uses balancing drills to improve a player's balance or using eye movement to improve the vision. Using all drills can lower the improvement of a player in various studies.
Stages of learning. In this section, we discuss again the relatively distinct stages of the learning process in more detail and describe the distinguishing characteristics of the learners in each. We say relatively distinct because there is some overlap between the stages, and the learners occasionally demonstrate characteristics of different stages at different times. The three stages we discuss here are the verbal cognitive stage, the motor stage, and the autonomous stage. The first one is the verbal cognitive stage. Learners in this verbal cognitive stage are confronted with an entirely unfamiliar task. Their challenge, as Gentle 1972 suggested, is to get a general idea of the movement. For example, people trying to use a sailboard for the first time must learn how and where to stand, how to hold the sail, and how to balance. As they go through this stage, they might be fascinated, simply by many ways they can manage to fall off the sailboard. As the label implies, learners in the verbal cognitive stage spend a lot of time talking verbal to themselves about what they are trying to do and thinking such cognitive about strategies that they might work. Perceptual learning and conceptual learning often accompany motor learning. During the early stage of skill learning, beginners sometimes need to experience the perceptual and conceptual elements of the skill as well as the general movement pattern. For example, a person learning to play a racquetball might improve her perception of a ball fight characteristics by observing the way the ball moves within the confines of the court, rebounding depending on the speed, angle, and spin. Such perceptual learning would improve the learner's anticipation of the approaching ball and allow her to position herself in an optimal location for effective returns. A beginning tennis player may need to think about the racquetball as an extension of his arm before he is able to position himself for effective ground strokes. Once the player understands this concept, he will begin to allow for the extra length when setting up for his shoots and, as a result, will make more frequent ball contact with the strings of the racket rather than with the shaft. Although verbal cognitive activity can help learners grasp the general idea of the skill, the activity begins to drop out as the learners become more experienced with the task. As might be expected, verbal and cognitive abilities dominate this initial stage of learning. Therefore, people who are good at figuring out what to do and how to go about doing it have a distinct advantage at this point. Gains in performance, proficiency in this stage, tend to be rather large and to occur rapidly, indicating that people quickly discover and use more effective strategies for performances. However, teachers and therapists should expect the performance of beginners to also be halting, jerky, uncertain, and poorly timed to objects and events in external environments.
Motor stage. Eventually, learners progress to the motor stage. Having solved most of the strategic or cognitive challenges and having achieved a general idea of what the movement is, they now shift their focus to refining the skill by organizing more effective movement patterns. A person's skills refinement is slightly different for quick movements than for slower ones. If the skill requires a rapid action, the learner begins to refine the motor program for accomplishing movement requirements. If the skill involves slower movements, the learner becomes more adept at processing and using movement-produced feedback to control the action. Similarly, this refinement will be different for closed skills than for open skills, which, as discussed before, depend on different processes. Several factors change markedly during the motor stage, most of which are associated with producing more effective movement patterns. Learners demonstrate more consistency as their strategies for skill refinement become more sophisticated and their movements become more grooved and stable. As learners discover regularities in that environment, their anticipation and timing develop, making their movements appear smoother and less rushed. This stage generally lasts considerably longer than the verbal cognitive stage, perhaps for several years or even decades, if the task is extremely complex.
The final stage is autonomous stage. This phase involves further practice of the skill in order to enhance the performance so that it becomes automatic. The learner has internalized the skill and is able to perform it with minimal cognitive monitoring. This means that the learner can pay more attention to other things, including other aspects of tasks or environmental features. The performance tends to be free of errors and adaptable with less feedback required. At this stage, performers can also produce the movement alongside the demanding task, as their attention capacity is no longer needed to control the action. For example, where they need to move to after their serve to be prepared for the return shot. Now, the key for the beginner is to continue practicing their basic step skills so that step skills are automatically understood, enabling them to connect the dots of the complex choreograph combinations and become a skilled or experienced step participant. When compared to the three phases of motor performance and learning, the acquisition phase of performance tends to correlate with the cognitive stage. The retention phase aligns more with the associative phase, and the transfer phase tends to relate to the autonomous stage.